Both parties say all of the above, right? And as Josh was just saying, it depends how you define all. But they both do say all of the above. And first of all, we want to unpack the essential differences, especially in nuclear and clean energy, so that we can understand how to move forward. Second of all, what do these differences mean for the industries and for solving our energy problems? And third, and this is where it really gets interesting, and we may just start the conversation this time and maybe continue it next time, but where are the potential consensus points, or where could old-fashioned horse trading enable Congress and the President to actually move on some of these big issues? It feels like there's the potential for action, and we want to identify where those areas for action are. We're going to do 3 minutes worth of what Boehner and Pelosi said in Tampa and Charlotte about energy at the Monitor Breakfast.
What you said about the national energy policy and its role in the recovery. You saw Governor Romney roll out his energy plan last week. It didn't include this renewable energy support, the wind tax credit that some of your Republicans do like and others don't like. How do you think you can continue positioning Republicans as the all-of-the-above party next year, maybe working on a big energy bill if that comes up?
Well, I think my colleagues are for an all-of-the-above national energy plan. Now, when I say all of the above, that doesn't mean we're going to subsidize all of the above. I think there's an awful lot of scrutiny going into how much subsidy goes to oil or gas or wind or solar or nuclear, because I believe that the marketplace will judge these various forms of energy in a much more efficient way than government could ever judge them. And so, but there is a lot more scrutiny over all the subsidies that go to various forms of energy supplies.
If you don't have an agenda, if your agenda is do nothing, there's nothing to negotiate. You know, the hardest thing in the world. Better you have an opponent who has a full agenda who says, for example, with President Bush, and this is for our host, with President Bush, we did the biggest energy bill in the history of our country. Efficiency, conservation, renewables, and one of the reasons we were able to get it done, President Bush wanted nuclear. We wanted renewables. Some in our caucus did not want nuclear. But we said, this is how we're going to get parity for nuclear and renewables, and so we're going down this path. And as we agreed on that, which was, it wasn't, they're in our party who wanted nuclear too, but by and large, there was a big constituency outside that didn't want us to go down this path, but we did. And that bill is the equivalent of taking millions of cars off the road. You see that gave the authority to President Obama right now to get up to about 55 miles per hour, per gallon, 55 miles per hour, and lifting the emission standard. It was the first time in 32 years we had raised the emission standard. 32 years. And so if they have something they want, then you can make some kind of an agreement. Nobody was elected monarch. We all have to compromise on these things, not our principles, but the timing of our goals and the rest of that.
Those two clips were actually a perfect example of where the two parties are, and I think they give a good indication of what's going to happen. What the Speaker did not say is it's going to be very difficult for Republicans to spend money on energy. He kind of said it when he said we're not going to subsidize everything. The reason it's going to be difficult for Republicans to spend money on energy is that it's going to be difficult for Republicans to spend money on anything. We're heading into a remarkable December, in a way more remarkable than the election, in that Congress has put itself in a large box with outcomes so draconian that they're inconceivable. And the thought is that if the outcomes are so draconian that they're inconceivable, that Congress will be forced to act. And this notion that the institution cannot function, and therefore we need to come up with new ways going forward that compel it to function, is becoming not the exception but the rule. We talk about that for about a minute because it really frames everything I think that's going to happen with energy. Think about base closings. Congress couldn't close a base to save its life because a lot of people had bases, and if you tried to close mine, I would threaten yours and we would band together and nothing happened. And so Congress said, okay, base closings is something we can't do, so we're setting up a base closing commission, and they will, in effect, decide what happens. It's very, very difficult to overturn what they say. We don't trust this institution to make political decisions, and therefore we're going to set up a framework that's going to allow an outcome to occur even if these guys can't agree on anything. And as you look forward to the interest in this panel, nuclear, can Congress figure out a way to permanently dispose nuclear waste? In June, an appellate court said, we don't think so. We don't think that the NRC has taken account of the fact that Congress may never figure out a way to dispose of nuclear waste. And therefore, go back to the drawing board. So we have now a 2-year period of studying what would be the environmental impact of never finding a permanent place to dispose of nuclear waste. And the whole permitting process is now linked to this expectation that Congress will not function. I would say this is fairly new in American history, that built into the process is the understanding that one of the branches of government no longer functions.
The question you posed, A, was about the Blue Ribbon Commission recommendations and how we move forward with those. We actually support the Blue Ribbon Commission recommendation very strongly. It's unlikely legislation is going to get done this year to change the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, but we think we need to keep those recommendations alive. This can't be another commission report that sits on the shelf. Right? We've got to move it forward at some point. Hopefully with the next Congress next year we can get moving on that.
Yeah, that's good. Good.
Well, on the Blue Ribbon Commission reports, I know there was a hearing yesterday.
Excuse me, this is Alec.
I'm sorry, Alec Hoppus from Arriva. I think piggybacking on what Gail opened the discussion with, one of the key recommendations of the Blue Ribbon Commission was to transfer the existing authority out of the Department of Energy, which is an institution whose leadership in this area has failed, and move it to an independent quasi-federal corporation structure that has access to the ratepayer money that has just basically been deposited in the Treasury and distributed elsewhere. And give them access to that ratepayer funding to carry out the mission as currently held within DOE. So I think it reflects some of this distrust of institutions that you mentioned, but it's also a point of general consensus. I think we saw Senator Bingaman introduce legislation that moves this authority outside of DOE. Chairman Upton in 2010 introduced different yet similar concepts to move the authority elsewhere, and the Blue Ribbon Commission validated that with one of their recommendations. So as far as consensus goes, I think everybody has recognized that the system for handling our used nuclear fuel management processes is broken under the current structures, needs to be transferred to a mission-specific entity that's less tied to the political process than DOE is and to the annual appropriations process, and give them a mandate to successfully meet that mission. And as Tony mentioned, I think the likelihood of much of any legislation getting done in this area is minimal this year, but it's also taken since 1987, since we've had a substantial reform. So you need to do it right, and we need to do it. And I think there's an urgency that's developed on.
And the question is, can we get it going next year? Right? I mean, does the election clarify things enough such that
I think we've seen enough of a consensus on some of these main points. And I know industry and other outside groups have been supportive of the Blue Ribbon Commission recommendations generally. That I think that there's enough kind of nonpartisan support to do something to get this program functioning. That we can identify an opportunity to do that now. Processes and procedures get caught up in other politics, but
right. Let's go to Josh. Josh, you're from Third Way. You're looking at where the opportunities are. Do you feel like, and I know you've been advising some campaigns and so forth, do you feel like there could be potential here, particularly on the Blue Ribbon Commission?
Well, taking a step back from the Blue Ribbon Commission, let's also remember that there has been progress over the last 4 years. We have loan guarantees that are proceeding for 2 new plants at Vogtle in Georgia. First new plants that will be built and come online in over 3 decades. We have another plant likely on next in line in South Carolina. So we do see glimmers of hope that new nuclear power will be put on the grid and generating electricity. Beyond that, there has been reform to the regulatory process at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission so that there is more certainty on how to proceed, how to get licensing. So those are all positive steps. I think the challenge we face is the broader issues that Gail alluded to, where you listen to Speaker Boehner and speaking about the marketplace judges energy or fuels much more efficiently than government. That is true to some extent. However, the market is nowhere near a perfect determinant either, particularly if you care about carbon, if you care about fuel diversity, or if you're looking at longer than a 3-6 month or even 2 to 3 year return. In those instances, there need to be other forces that provide the certainty to financing, provide the regulatory certainty, and internalize some of those currently external costs so that for organizations like ours that really believe a significant increase in nuclear energy is critical for the economic and environmental success of the country, does go forward. And that gets to a fundamental philosophical difference, unfortunately, between some in each party. And that may have to be ironed out at some point in the next several election cycles or elsewhere before we see the kind of renaissance in nuclear energy that Third Way firmly believes we need.
Good. Well, talking about the market, maybe we could go to Nick Loris from Heritage. Nick, I know you're an economist and look at the effect of regulations and government action on the market. Give us a view from your standpoint about how what happens in D.C. affects the market and the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. And while the market may not be perfect, we at the Heritage Foundation certainly think it works a lot more efficiently than what the government does. But I think there can be common ground on the regulatory obstacles that all energy projects face. If you look at the Chamber of Commerce's Project No Project, they list hundreds of energy projects that have been held up in onerous and duplicative regulatory obstacles, and over half of them are renewables. And we want to see those regulatory obstacles removed so all of these projects can come online efficiently, so long as they can do so, as Speaker Boehner said, without subsidies. And I think we have a diverse electricity market. I think that's something that really goes overlooked. We have coal, we have natural gas, we have nuclear, we have renewables and hydro. So there is a diverse electricity market. It should be up to that profit and loss incentive and creating that regulatory framework so costs aren't driven up, especially on these smaller renewable projects, where driving up the costs in litigation could force these projects to become uneconomical. And I think furthermore, creating a regulatory framework for small nuclear reactors to come online more efficiently and creating a structure where the NRC isn't just focused on these large light water reactors, so we create even more diversity in the market through creating a more open regulatory framework, certainly could do a lot to promote competition in the electricity marketplace. Good.
Okay. Thanks, Nick. The last person who hasn't talked, Mihaela from Atlantic Council. Mihaela, I know you look at nuclear, how different countries handle nuclear around the world. Are there lessons that we can take from other countries that would help us solve this issue and move forward?
There are, and one issue that actually is found in the Romney platform is the standardization of the nuclear designs. We have 115, and correct me if I'm wrong, on the number of nuclear reactors and almost as many designs. What would make the NRC's life easier would be if we had more commonality between the designs and a closer standardization. We look at France, and they've made that decision decades ago to go, and Riva's right here, and they can speak to that more. And that can help you mitigate risks, learn lessons faster in terms of how can you improve the design. if you have a problem within one power plant, you would understand how to fix it faster and it wouldn't be replicated throughout your system.
This is Jim Ostroff. I'm with Platts Nuclear Publications.
Great.
And I'll ask any and all about this. Can we really expect much on nuclear power from either candidate for president, when you have the Democrats and Obama talking about their support for all of the above and all of the above energy policy, but frequently they omit nuclear. Asked about that later, going back, nuclear is not on the agenda as far as high-level campaign is concerned. On the Romney side, you have a new energy policy that looks at nuclear and then says we need to move forward. The United States has not approved any new reactor construction in more than 30 years, seemingly forgetting that NRC this year approved 4 new units. So the question has to be asked in terms of nuclear, whether this really is on the radar screen, whether they're serious, and whether, therefore, we can expect to see anything more on nuclear of any substance in the next 4 years. That's it.
Thank you.
So I think the first question to ask is, why would either candidate or either party believe that we need nuclear energy? I think the Obama administration, when we separate the administration from what the campaign has said, has made it clear, both from the president to Stephen Chu to even Carol Browner when she was in the administration, that they believe that nuclear energy is a critical part of reducing carbon emissions in the United States and solving climate change. If you ask the Romney campaign, because there isn't a Romney administration as of yet, may not be, whether nuclear is a critical part of addressing climate change, you do run into a problem in that it's not clear at all if they believe climate change is happening or if there needs to be any government action to address that. You peel it back a level further and you look at what congressional Republicans have done, and there's fantastic support for nuclear amongst Senate Republicans. Lamar Alexander is one of the great national leaders on this issue. Lisa Murkowski, who will either be the chair or ranking member of the Energy Committee, is a fantastic supporter. And the list gets much longer from there. On the House side, however, the reauthorization of loan guarantees for nuclear that included nuclear energy ran into significant problems with the House Republican caucus. And the amendment that was going to kill it had to be defeated with significant Democratic support to move nuclear forward. Now, that doesn't mean that it's a black and white issue with Democrats supporting nuclear and Republicans opposing it, far from it. But the reality with $2 or $3 or $4 natural gas is it's going to be very hard if you leave the marketplace as it is, even if you strip out all regulations, which frankly from our perspective would be very bad for the nuclear sector, to see new nuclear built on its own at any time in the near future. And so that leads to the question of why do you want it built in the short to medium term, and looking at the candidates who will actually get it done.
Both the Republicans and Democrats will support nuclear because it makes sense to. First, you get a clean, safe, reliable generation source from 60 to 80 years with our new plants. It doesn't generate any greenhouse gases whatsoever. Safe, reliable electricity is what differentiates nuclear. It's the only expandable baseload source of electricity we have in this country. From a jobs perspective, not just the domestic jobs associated with new plant build. In Georgia, it's a tremendous economic engine for the state of Georgia. You're going to have up to 4,000 construction jobs there and 700 permanent jobs going forward with the new plant. But look at the global market for nuclear. Okay, 60 plants are under construction globally. And while you've had setbacks in Japan, obviously, for obvious reasons, and in Germany, nuclear is still proceeding, in particular in Asia with China and India. There's a big part of the U.S. domestic capabilities of the supply chain that can be utilized for that new plant construction, bringing thousands of jobs. Just in the last 7 years, when we've had a major recession in our country, our nuclear industry has added 41,000 jobs. So there's economic benefits, there's clean air benefits, and there's reliable electricity benefits. That's why we think both Democrats and Republicans today support and will continue to support nuclear energy.
We're looking at things too much in the short run. Congress is too much locked into the short run. Yes, there's maybe a fiscal cliff, maybe there's sequestration, the sky is falling, everything's terrible, the budget is terrible. All is true. These things may happen. However, we have about 1 trillion barrels of oil equivalent in the ground in this country, including natural gas. At $150 a barrel, taxed at 10%, the storm will be over if this is allowed to happen. What we have is the possibility of going through a storm, and in 3 to 5 years, probably nothing's going to happen in nuclear to make these things relax enough to have big investment. If I were a nuclear investor and I was thinking about dropping $1 billion, part of the cost of a firm, in this situation with regulatory uncertainty and budget uncertainty and economic uncertainty and so forth, I probably wouldn't do it. I would be thinking in another direction. But anyway, let's go through the storm. Let's get beyond the storm. Think about the long-term future, not the short-term future. And that's the way to look at this issue. And this is the way to look at energy issues as well. What we're considering things as is within bounded rationality. We're not looking at all the data out there. And there are data that can help us through this. Your industry, oil and gas industry, solar industry, the whole business has to take a long-term perspective in this environment. Otherwise, we're going to lose it.
I say, I completely agree with what you said about the long term. The problem is we are in an election, and the economy is the way it is right now, and people want, it's the public. And as we were speaking about earlier, the public might not understand why energy is such a huge issue. And the public wants to see, when they do bring up energy as an issue in the election, the public doesn't want to hear about what's going to happen in 10 years with the nuclear plant and jobs, which, yes, you're totally correct on. Obviously, it's created an immense amount of jobs. And when the economy was down, nuclear was doing well. So the public wants to see what's going to happen now. And, in no way am I being biased because natural gas is my background. But, and this is, again, nobody's looking long term, which they should be. But in the short term right now, there is natural gas. And while there's all this discussion of exporting it, keeping it here, both the two biggest issues that are discussed in energy that both candidates will openly discuss, while Romney, yes, will discuss about nuclear at certain events. In the convention you saw, they spoke about oil and natural gas. Both are very pro-domestic production because that is immediate. That is what's in the public. That's what the public's seeing. That is something that can happen right now. And that will create jobs as well. Not that I'm saying nuclear won't. It's just that's a long-term view, and the public wants to see what's going to happen now. These people are trying to get elected. They're not looking in 10 years. They're looking in 4.
The energy sector is really not a sector that fits very well in the short-term approach. Yes, I understand that people have to get elected and the messages have to resonate with the public, but I'm wondering, and I'm wondering out loud here, if it's a chicken and egg problem where is the campaign having to capture the public's attention, talking about short-term issues that then, once the campaign is over, we're looking at Congress and the way they're looking at issues, they are looking out months. They're trying to keep passing budget extensions and not actually dealing with the underlying long-term issues. The energy industry is an industry with assets with a lifespan between 40, 50, 60 years. And when you have to make those kind of investment decisions, and maybe, again, wondering out loud, maybe the way we can change the debate is to look more of a global perspective. The U.S. has to have a realistic and balanced energy portfolio. It can't put all its eggs in one basket. At the same time, it can maintain competitiveness and its own industry's competitiveness so that it can be the one that's exporting right now shale gas technology to Europe, to Asia. That knowledge isn't in Europe, for example. And the U.S. companies have a wonderful opportunity, they're trying to take full advantage of it, especially in countries like Poland and Romania and in China. They're working very hard with technology that was developed here in the U.S. So that kind of message can then be broadcast at the larger industry level.
Is there potential action on trade policy and making sure that the U.S. does stay competitive in nuclear innovation and so forth?
I would say from a competitiveness standpoint, if you look at the benefits delivered by nuclear energy, the cost effectiveness, affordability, the stability and sustainability components of it, that's the kind of energy foundation that enables all sorts of other industry to thrive. And I think other countries across the world are starting to recognize that and to a greater and greater degree. I think we've got, while the U.S. market is kind of pinned in by short-term considerations, and let's face it, some of it is economy related, some of it is regulatory uncertainty and just uncertainty about the economy generally. You don't want to pile a bunch of, front-loaded huge capital investments in that environment. Other countries in particular in Asia are committing to large fleet expansions, and the U.S. needs to play in that market space. And the best way to do that is to have a well-trained engineering backbone here in the U.S. that can help build these products, export them to help meet the requirements and demand overseas. If we're not sustaining our current fleet, if we're not building new reactors here in the U.S., we're going to be at a significant disadvantage in being able to leverage our natural workforce strengths in order to provide the kind of exported components and services that would feed this growth overseas.
When American companies compete for bids overseas, the American companies are too often left to compete on their own. So the South Korean entities will bid on a new opportunity, and it will be Team South Korea. It will be Team China, Team France, whomever. Too often, American companies find themselves trying to maneuver through all of the different bureaucratic and bidding processes without sufficient assistance from the federal government, and at a disadvantage because other countries have figured out that it is part of the national imperative to have a very robust nuclear manufacturing sector. And that's an opportunity. I think there's bipartisan consensus on that, but we do need to fix that. Right? Well, unfortunately,
I'm sure there are some.
There are some, and in this political environment, even when there's not disagreement, we seem unable to act on it.
Do we need a commission? How does this?
There's actually a coordinator in the White House now.
Yeah, which is an important step forward.
Yeah. Okay.
And the other challenge is that not only on the manufacturing side, but right now the NRC and INPO are the gold standards of nuclear safety around the world. It will remain that way for a long time, and hopefully for as far as we can see. But if the United States doesn't continue to build new reactors, and we start seeing China and India build more and more reactors, our ability to set the standard internationally for safety becomes more difficult. And that is not something that, unfortunately, the market will ever take into account on its own, but that the U.S. government, American companies need to factor in when we're figuring out what our policies are moving forward.
On renewable energy, and I'd love to kind of turn the conversation back to this whole idea of a free market, which is something I, as a Republican, strongly support, but yet also recognize that there is literally no such thing in the energy sector. It has to be one of the most regulated, subsidized markets we've had. You talk about all the nuclear we have today. I don't think we'd have any of that without government support and policies for that in the past. And the 2 nuclear plants that we were discussing are being built because of federal government loan guarantees. You look at the oil industry and gas industry, which have had subsidies for, in many cases, decades. And I was reading in a hearing yesterday, a CEO of Continental Energy, I believe, was telling Congress that if they got rid of the oil subsidies for them, drilling and activity would decline 40% in this country and end the energy renaissance. So I find it just kind of a paradox. You look at gas pipelines. We would have no gas, we wouldn't be having this gas renaissance today and the ability to take advantage of it without federal government FERC authority to site pipelines. And we don't have that with transmission, which is one reason why wind and a lot of renewable energy technologies are falling behind. So I think a better term is more of a level playing field within a regulated market.
That's a loaded question, and I probably could go on a 40-minute diatribe as to what the answer would, or what Heritage's answer would be.
40 seconds.
Yeah, 40 seconds. I'll give you the abbreviated version. One, I completely agree. I think we need to remove subsidies for all energy sources, and if those oil and gas fields were to close as a result of removing those subsidies, then, because they're uneconomical, then that's fine. But we should also realize that there's a lot of areas in the United States that aren't open to oil and gas exploration where we could be producing energy at $60 a barrel. We're the only country in the world that that limits its territorial waters to drilling. So opening access, I think, is critical. And two, labeling what's a subsidy and what's not a subsidy is also important. And with oil and gas, it gets extremely complicated. One of the ones everyone talks about is the Section 199 manufacturing tax credit. That's not unique to the oil and gas industry. It's available to all manufacturers, and in fact, the oil and gas industry only gets to take it at 6% when all other manufacturers get to take it at 9%. So, if you want to completely scrap the tax code and how capital costs are expensed and depreciated over time, I think you can have a legitimate conversation as to how energy projects are built. But to wrap up, I agree with you. Getting rid of all subsidies is where Heritage would like to see this happen, but at the same time, it gets extremely politicized as to what's a subsidy and what's not a subsidy.
Given public awareness of the many threats or dangers of nuclear waste disposal and the necessity of anti-proliferation efforts, I'm wondering if there's really any political gain to be had in pushing for more nuclear power stations to be put online before we deal with a national policy for securing and disposing of nuclear waste. And if that in fact is a hurdle, how exactly are we going to come back together as a country and deal with this issue? Is Yucca Mountain dead? Are there people that are actually going to try to put it back on the agenda? And if so, where's that political capital coming from? And then to touch on markets for a second, are those costs that are going to be able to be internalized by nuclear power? Is that cost going to be, is that bill going to be footed by the American public?
Well, I know there was a hearing yesterday related to the Blue Ribbon Commission, and maybe there was a little bit of momentum on that. Hannah Northey, I know you were at the hearing. Do you want to? Hannah's from E&E Publishing, and maybe you can shed some light on that.
So I think that the Senate right now, that legislation obviously isn't going anywhere, as we discussed this Congress. But Senator Bingaman, Alexander, Murkowski, they've put a lot of work into what could be legislation into the next Congress. I guess that's a question maybe for the panel. Is anything going to be done under a Romney administration or possibly another Obama administration? And I think there's disagreement there about, can you move forward with temporary solutions before you find a permanent repository? That's a real sticking point. And how is it going to be funded? And if you create an agency to oversee the entire process, what kind of a hand should the government have? Should it be a federal agency or should it be independent? So those, at the hearing yesterday at the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee hearing, those were big sticking points, big questions, and it's unclear under which administration who's going to take the lead on that. So maybe we could bring it back to the panel with that question.
Tackle from Ariva and NEI. Do you need that certainty about we've got Yucca Mountain or another site sorted out before you can really proceed?
Well, let me take the first crack at it. First with the safety issue you raised. The used fuel is safe. It's either in a used fuel pool at each site or in dry cask storage. Okay, and despite all we may have read and seen about Japan, there was no damage to the used fuel in those spent fuel pools with a historic earthquake, tsunami, and hydrogen explosions. The used fuel remained stable in the pools. Okay, so those are very robust structures, and the used fuel is safe for the foreseeable future. Okay, moving to the second one. Repeat your question again.
Do you need the certainty around a permanent storage site before you feel like you can really move forward with? There are a lot of pieces you're going to have to put together, right, in order for a nuclear renaissance to really take off. But one is clearly, the waste thing is maybe an 800-pound gorilla, right? Do you have to have absolute certainty on that before moving forward?
The short answer is no.
Okay.
The waste confidence decision, which you started with, was very, very important because we're trying to deal with that generically so it wouldn't be an impediment to individual licensing proceedings, whether they're new plants or for license renewal. But going back to the way you started, it does raise a lot of uncertainty in terms of policy going forward when you can't decide whether it's safe or not. It's safe for the foreseeable future. My boss likes to say this is the only problem that a bunch of people spend a lot of time on in the near term for something that's going to be out there for, and we're not going to see it for decades, and it'll be out there for thousands of years. So we need a policy again, a national policy on used fuel management. I think the Blue Ribbon Commission lays the foundation for that, and now we've got to get it through Congress and through the next administration and change the Nuclear Waste Policy Act.
I would echo those comments, and specifically on the need for a permanent solution. I don't think that we should tie our hands in that way, even through the legislative process. I think as we address this issue in amending the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, I think one of the things that the Blue Ribbon Commission appropriately highlighted was the need for flexibility and implementation approaches so that they could move on parallel tracks for a geologic repository along with consolidated storage sites. At AREVA, we see used nuclear fuel as a resource and not a waste, and so directly disposing of it in the ground doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, but providing the opportunity for research and development and other ways to extract that energy value from the used fuel in the intermediate term and longer term perhaps makes sense. Perhaps the economics dictate otherwise, but the flexibility required of the system needs to be built into whatever legislative solution comes out, I think.
Actually, I came out of this with hope, having come in.
If one person was turned, look at that. We have succeeded.
I will tell you why. I mean, in 30 seconds, we talked about the need for an energy policy, including a national policy on used fuel management. To me, that's a critical one. We need a long-term view. We need regulatory certainty. There's some disagreement here as to whether or not we need a level playing field with no subsidies, let the market decide, or subsidies in a way that is understood as fair or helpful. But the key question is, where is the political capital going to come from for this long-term view? And as I think competitiveness, international competitiveness, is a very important tool. Think about what happened with Sputnik. Do you really think we would have had a space program if someone hadn't said, well, the Russians are beating us, for God's sake. I mean, we've got to do something about this. I mean, and that drove so much. I mean, that arguably even had something to do with the highway program, getting money in a way that would move the country forward. The same thing happened in a lesser degree with education, which I covered for 3 years. I mean, the education debate for decades had been, should the federal government be involved in local schools? Isn't that a local decision? And then, starting in the late 70s and especially the 80s and really in the 90s, a bunch of think tanks started doing international comparisons. And year after year, these reports would come out, which had the U.S., moving from top to the middle, and then by the end, we were sort of duking it out with Rwanda in math and science. And at that point, you started to see politicians pay attention because they were hearing about this from voters at home. Are we really, at the same level of, Rwanda? I mean, what's going on here? And suddenly, the ground changed. And you saw standards-based reform and regular testing and math and science given priority over everything else. Now, you can argue as to whether or not it was successful, but it certainly was successful at mobilizing political capital. If you ask most Americans, what do you know about nuclear power? Have you ever seen a film that showed a nuclear reactor that didn't blow up at some point in the film? I never have. How do you start showing people what the rest of the world is like? We've certainly had enough blackouts to get people's attention to what happens when, there isn't fuel, and look at what other countries are doing. And it may take years, may take decades. Maybe we don't have them. But I do think that if you don't start changing the perception out there that will influence the members of Congress, as they did with Sputnik, as they did with education, we're going to be talking to you are going to be talking to yourselves. We journalists are going to be standing high and observing what's happening. But I do think international competitiveness is a very important tool in this.